The sky was a bruised purple, the kind of color that only appears in the moments before a storm. Rain tapped lightly against the windows of a small, dimly lit apartment on the edge of the city. Inside, a man named Elias sat at his kitchen table, staring blankly at a half-empty cup of coffee. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes hollow. He looked like a man who had given up on life, though he couldn't quite remember why. Unseen by Elias, a figure stood in the corner of the room. This was Azrael, a guardian angel who had been assigned to Elias for the past 27 years. Azrael was not like the angels depicted in paintings or described in hymns. His wings were not radiant, they were dull and frayed, their once golden hue now faded to a dusty gray. His face, though still ethereally beautiful, was etched with lines of exhaustion. His eyes, which had once sparkled with divine purpose, now held a deep, unshakable weariness. Azrael sighed, a sound that echoed faintly in the room, though Elias didn't seem to notice. The angel had been doing this job. The storm outside grew louder, the rain pounding against the windows like 1,000 tiny fists. Azrael stepped closer to Elias, his presence causing the air to grow colder. He leaned down, his lips almost brushing against the man's ear. "Do you even care anymore?" Azrael whispered, his voice a mixture of anger and despair. "Do you even notice the world around you? Or are you just waiting for it all to end?" Elias shivered, though he didn't know why. He rubbed his arms and glanced around the room, feeling a strange, unexplainable sense of unease. For a moment, he thought he heard a voice, but it was so faint, so distant, that he convinced himself it was just his imagination. Azrael straightened up, his wings drooping behind him. He had always been told that his work was sacred, that he was fulfilling a divine purpose. But what was the point if the ones he was supposed to protect didn't even care? What was the point if they were determined to destroy themselves? The angel turned away from Elias and walked toward the window. He placed his hand against the glass, feeling the cold seep into his skin. Outside, the storm raged on, lightning splitting the sky like a jagged wound. Azrael stared into the darkness, his mind racing with thoughts he had never dared to entertain before. What if he just stopped? What if he walked away from it all? What if he left Elias to face the storm alone? The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. Azrael had never considered abandoning his post before. It went against everything he had been taught, everything he believed in. But the more he thought about it, the more appealing it became. He was so tired, so very tired. Maybe it was time to let go. Azrael took a deep breath and closed his eyes. He could feel the pull of the celestial realm, the place where he was supposed to return when his work was done. But he didn't want to go back there. Not yet. Not ever. He opened his eyes and looked back at Elias, who was still sitting at the table, lost in his own thoughts. The man looked so small, so fragile. Azrael felt a pang of guilt, but it was quickly overshadowed by his exhaustion. "I'm sorry," Azrael whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was apologizing to Elias or to himself. "I can't do this anymore." With that, the angel spread his wings and stepped through the window, disappearing into the storm. The storm swallowed Azrael whole as he stepped through the window. Rain lashed against his face, and the wind howled like a chorus of lost souls. He soared through the darkened sky, his wings cutting through the tempest with ease, though his heart felt heavier than ever. The city below was a blur of lights and shadows, a chaotic tapestry of human life that he had once sworn to protect. Now it felt alien to him, a world he no longer belonged to. Azrael flew aimlessly, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He had never felt so lost, so untethered. For centuries, his purpose had been clear: guide, protect, serve. But now, that purpose felt hollow, a meaningless repetition of tasks that led nowhere. He had seen too much pain, too much despair. And for what? To watch the humans he guarded stumble through life, oblivious to his presence, ungrateful for his efforts? The angel descended toward a desolate park on the outskirts of the city. The trees swayed violently in the storm, their branches clawing at the sky like desperate hands. Azrael landed softly on the wet grass, his wings folding behind him. He walked toward a crumbling stone fountain, its basin filled with murky water. The statue at its center, a figure of an angel with outstretched wings, was cracked and weathered, its face worn smooth by time. Azrael stared at the statue, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Is this what I've become?" he muttered. "A broken relic, forgotten and useless?" He sat on the edge of the fountain, the cold stone seeping through his robes. The storm raged around him, but he barely noticed. His thoughts were consumed by the decision he had made, the line he had crossed. He had abandoned Elias, a soul he was sworn to protect. It was a betrayal of his duty, a sin that would surely have consequences. But in that moment, Azrael didn't care. He was tired of playing the role of the selfless guardian, tired of sacrificing himself for beings who didn't even know he existed. As he sat there, a faint glow caught his eye. He turned to see a small, flickering light hovering a few feet away. It was a will-o'-the-wisp, a tiny spirit often seen in places of deep sorrow or regret. The light danced around him, its movements playful yet mournful. "What do you want?" Azrael asked, his voice tinged with irritation. The will-o'-the-wisp didn't respond. Instead, it floated closer, its light casting eerie shadows on the ground. Azrael reached out to touch it, but the spirit darted away, leading him deeper into the park. Against his better judgment, the angel followed. The spirit led him to an old, gnarled tree, its roots twisted and exposed. At the base of the tree was a small, hidden door, barely visible beneath the overgrown grass. The will-o'-the-wisp hovered above the door, its light pulsing with an almost hypnotic rhythm. Azrael hesitated. He had seen enough of the world to know that some doors were better left unopened. But something about this place called to him, a strange, magnetic pull that he couldn't ignore. He knelt down and pushed the door open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading underground. The will-o'-the-wisp floated down the stairs, its light illuminating the way. Azrael followed, his footsteps echoing in the narrow passage. The air grew colder as he descended, and the walls seemed to close in around him. He could feel a presence here, something ancient and powerful. At the bottom of the stairs, he found himself in a small, circular chamber. The walls were covered in strange symbols, their meanings lost to time. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and on it rested a single, unlit candle. The will-o'-the-wisp floated above the candle, its light growing brighter. Azrael approached the pedestal, his curiosity piqued. He reached out to touch the candle, and as soon as his fingers brushed against it, the room was filled with a blinding light. Images flashed before his eyes. Scenes of his past, moments he had long forgotten. He saw the first soul he had ever guarded, a young girl who had died too soon. He saw the countless battles he had fought against darkness, the lives he had saved, the tears he had wiped away. But he also saw the failures, the souls he had lost, the battles he had lost, the moments when his efforts had been in vain. The images came faster and faster, overwhelming him. He fell to his knees, his hands clutching his head. "Stop!" he cried, his voice echoing in the chamber. "Please stop!" The light dimmed, and the images faded. Azrael was left kneeling in the darkness, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The will-o'-the-wisp hovered above him, its light now soft and comforting. "Why are you showing me this?" Azrael asked, his voice trembling. The spirit didn't answer. Instead, it floated toward the wall, illuminating one of the symbols. Azrael stood and approached the wall, his eyes narrowing as he studied the symbol. It was an ancient sigil, one he recognized from his early days as a guardian. It represented balance, the delicate equilibrium between light and darkness, hope and despair. As he stared at the symbol, a realization dawned on him. He had been so focused on the darkness, so consumed by the suffering he had witnessed, that he had forgotten the light. He had forgotten the moments of joy, the victories, the lives he had touched in ways he couldn't even comprehend. But was that enough? Was the light worth the endless struggle, the constant battle against the darkness? Azrael wasn't sure. He still felt the weight of his exhaustion, the ache of his doubt. But for the first time in a long time, he felt something else, a flicker of hope. The will-o'-the-wisp floated back to the pedestal, its light fading as it settled above the candle. Azrael watched as the spirit's light dimmed and then disappeared, leaving him alone in the darkness. He took a deep breath and reached out to the candle once more. This time, when he touched it, a small flame sprang to life, casting a warm, golden light throughout the chamber. The symbols on the walls seemed to glow in response, their meanings suddenly clear. Azrael stood there for a long time, staring at the flame. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing: he couldn't give up. Not yet. Not while there was still light in the world. With a renewed sense of purpose, Azrael turned and climbed the stairs, leaving the chamber behind. The storm had passed, and the sky was beginning to clear. The first rays of dawn broke through the clouds, casting a soft, golden light over the city. Azrael spread his wings and took to the sky, his heart lighter than it had been in years. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing. He would face it with courage, no matter how weary he felt. The city was waking up as Azrael flew back toward Elias's apartment. The storm had left the streets glistening, the air fresh and clean. Birds chirped in the distance, their songs a stark contrast to the chaos of the night before. Azrael's wings cut through the morning air with purpose, though his mind was still a tangle of thoughts. The encounter in the underground chamber had shaken him, but it had also reignited something he thought he'd lost. A flicker of hope, a sense of duty that hadn't completely burned out. When he reached the apartment, he paused outside the window, his hand hovering over the glass. He could see Elias inside, still sitting at the kitchen table, though now he was slumped forward, his head resting on his arms. The man looked even more broken than before, as if the storm had drained what little strength he had left. Azrael hesitated. He had walked away from Elias, abandoned him in his darkest moment. Could he really just waltz back in as if nothing had happened? Would Elias even sense his presence, or would he remain oblivious, lost in his own despair? The angel took a deep breath and stepped through the window, the air shimmering faintly as he crossed the threshold. The room felt colder than before, the weight of Elias's sorrow pressing down like a physical force. Azrael approached the table, his footsteps silent on the worn wooden floor. "Elias," he whispered, his voice soft but firm. "I'm here." Elias didn't move. He didn't even seem to hear. Azrael frowned, his frustration bubbling up again. He reached out, his hand hovering just above the man's shoulder. For a moment, he considered shaking him, forcing him to acknowledge his presence. But he stopped himself. That wasn't how this worked. He couldn't force Elias to see him, to believe in him. All he could do was be there, whether Elias knew it or not. The angel sighed and pulled up a chair, sitting across from Elias. He studied the man's face, the lines of exhaustion, the shadows under his eyes. He had watched over Elias for so long, but he realized now that he had never truly seen him. Not like this. Not as a person, with all his flaws and fears and fragile humanity. "I'm sorry," Azrael said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I shouldn't have left you. I was selfish. I forgot why I'm here." Elias stirred slightly, his brow furrowing as if he were caught in a dream. Azrael leaned forward, his gaze intense. "You're not alone, Elias," he said. "You never were. I've been here all along, even when you couldn't see me. Even when you didn't want to." For a moment, it seemed like Elias might respond. His lips parted and a faint sound escaped his throat. But then his head drooped again and he was still. Azrael sat back, his shoulders slumping. He had hoped for something. A sign, a glimmer of recognition. But there was nothing. Just silence. The angel stood and walked to the window, staring out at the city. The sun was fully up now, its light washing over the buildings and streets. Life was moving on as it always did. But inside this apartment, time seemed to stand still, trapped in a bubble of despair. Azrael clenched his fists, his frustration giving way to determination. He couldn't give up on Elias. Not again. If the man couldn't see him, couldn't hear him, then he would have to find another way to reach him. He turned back to Elias, his eyes narrowing as an idea began to form. It was risky, maybe even forbidden. But he was past caring about the rules. If he was going to save Elias, he would have to do something drastic. Azrael stood in the center of Elias's apartment, his wings slightly spread, his expression resolute. The idea that had taken root in his mind was dangerous, perhaps even blasphemous. But he was beyond caution now. If he couldn't reach Elias through whispers and unseen gestures, he would have to make himself known in a way that couldn't be ignored. The angel closed his eyes and focused, drawing on the celestial energy that flowed through him. It was a power he had used countless times before, to shield, to heal, to guide. But this time he intended to use it differently. He was going to manifest himself, to step into the mortal world in a way that would make him visible, tangible, real to Elias. The air around him began to shimmer, a faint golden light emanating from his body. The room grew warmer, the oppressive cold of Elias's despair pushed back by the radiant energy. Azrael's wings, once dull and frayed, began to glow with a soft, ethereal light. His form became more solid, more defined, until he no longer looked like a shadowy figure in the corner of the room. He looked like an angel. Elias stirred at the sudden change in the atmosphere. He lifted his head, his eyes bleary and unfocused. For a moment, he simply stared at Azrael as if trying to decide whether the figure before him was real or a figment of his exhausted mind. Who are you?" Elias croaked, his voice hoarse from disuse. Azrael took a step forward, his movements deliberate and calm. "My name is Azrael," he said, his voice clear and resonant. "I've been with you for a long time, Elias. Longer than you can imagine." Elias blinked, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What are you talking about? How did you get in here?" Azrael ignored the questions. He knelt in front of Elias, his golden eyes locking onto the man's weary gaze. "You're not alone," he said firmly. "You never have been. I've been here, watching over you, protecting you. But I lost my way. I let my own doubts cloud my purpose. And for that, I'm sorry." Elias stared at him, his expression a mixture of disbelief and fear. This isn't real," he muttered, shaking his head. "I'm dreaming. Or I finally lost it." Azrael reached out and placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. The touch was warm, solid, undeniably real. "You're not dreaming," he said gently. "And you haven't lost anything. You've just been lost. But I'm here to help you find your way back." Elias flinched at the touch, his eyes widening. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he began to tremble, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Azrael could feel the man's fear, his confusion, his pain. It was overwhelming, a torrent of emotions that threatened to drown them both. The angel tightened his grip on Elias's shoulder, his voice steady and calm. "Breathe, Elias. Just breathe. You're safe. I'm here." For a long moment, Elias simply sat there, his body shaking as he struggled to process what was happening. But slowly, gradually, his breathing began to even out. The trembling subsided, and he looked up at Azrael with a mixture of awe and desperation. "Why?" he whispered. "Why are you here? Why now?" Azrael hesitated. How could he explain centuries of devotion, of silent guardianship to a man who had never known he existed? How could he make Elias understand the weight of his own doubts, his own failures? "Because you matter," Azrael said simply. "Because even when you can't see it, even when you don't believe it, your life has meaning. And I forgot that for a while. But I remember now. And I'm not going to leave you again." Elias stared at him, his eyes searching Azrael's face for some sign of deception, some hint that this was all a cruel trick. But all he saw was sincerity, a deep, unwavering resolve that he couldn't explain. "I don't know what to do," Elias admitted, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to fix this. To fix me." Azrael smiled faintly, his expression softening. "You don't have to do it alone," he said. "That's why I'm here. To help you. To guide you. But you have to trust me." Elias hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I don't know if I can," he said quietly. "I don't know if I can trust anyone. Not even myself." Azrael nodded, understanding the depth of Elias's pain. "That's okay," he said. "You don't have to trust me right away. But let me show you. Let me prove to you that you're not alone." Elias didn't respond, but he didn't pull away either. Azrael took that as a small victory. He stood and extended a hand to Elias, his golden eyes filled with determination. "Come with me," he said. "There's something I want to show you." Elias looked at the outstretched hand, his expression uncertain. But after a moment, he reached out and took it, his grip tentative but firm. Azrael helped him to his feet, the warmth of the angel's touch spreading through Elias's body like a soothing balm. "Where are we going?" Elias asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Azrael smiled, a hint of mischief in his eyes. "Somewhere you've never been before." With that, the angel spread his wings, the golden light intensifying until it filled the room. Elias gasped as the world around them seemed to dissolve, replaced by a swirling vortex of light and color. For a moment, he felt weightless, untethered from reality. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sensation stopped. Elias blinked, his vision slowly adjusting to the new surroundings. He was no longer in his apartment. He was standing on a vast, shimmering plain, the sky above him a breathtaking tapestry of stars and swirling galaxies. The ground beneath his feet was soft, like walking on clouds, and the air was filled with a faint, melodic hum. Where are we?" Elias asked, his voice filled with awe. Azrael stood beside him, his wings glowing softly in the starlight. "This is the veil," he said. "A place between worlds. A place where the boundaries of reality are flexible." Elias turned to him, his eyes wide. "Why did you bring me here?" Azrael's expression grew serious. "Because you need to see something. Something that might help you understand." He gestured toward the horizon, where a faint light was beginning to grow. As Elias watched, the light expanded, forming into a series of images, scenes from his own life. He saw himself as a child, laughing and playing in the sun. He saw himself as a young man, full of hope and ambition. And he saw the moments of pain, the losses, the failures. But he also saw something else, small, fleeting moments of light. A kind word from a stranger. A moment of unexpected joy. A glimmer of hope in the darkest times. These are the moments I've been there for, Azrael said softly. The moments you didn't even notice. But they mattered, Elias. They all mattered. Elias stared at the images, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to look away, to deny what he was seeing. But he couldn't. The truth was too powerful, too undeniable. I didn't know, he whispered, tears streaming down his face. I didn't know you were there. Azrael placed a hand on his shoulder, his touch warm and reassuring. I know, he said, but I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. Elias stood in the veil, the images of his life swirling around him like fragments of a dream. He reached out, his fingers brushing against a scene of himself as a child running through a field of wildflowers. The memory was so vivid, so alive, that it took his breath away. He could almost feel the sun on his skin, the wind in his hair. But as quickly as the joy came, it was replaced by a pang of sorrow. That child was gone, buried under years of pain and regret. Azrael watched him closely, his golden eyes filled with compassion. He could see the turmoil in Elias's heart, the struggle between hope and despair. The angel knew that this moment was fragile, a tipping point that could go either way. He had shown Elias the light, but the darkness was still there, lurking in the corners of his mind. Do you see now? Azrael asked gently. Do you see how much you've endured? How much you've overcome? Elias didn't answer right away. He was still staring at the images, his expression a mixture of awe and anguish. Finally, he turned to Azrael, his eyes glistening with tears. I see it, he said, his voice trembling. But it doesn't change anything. It doesn't change what I've done. What I've lost. Azrael frowned, his wings twitching slightly. What do you mean? Elias looked away, his shoulders slumping. You showed me the good moments, but what about the bad ones? The mistakes? The people I hurt? You can't just ignore that. The angel stepped closer, his gaze intense. I'm not ignoring it, Elias. I'm showing you that there's more to your story than just the pain. Yes, you've made mistakes. Yes, you've lost people. But that doesn't define you. What defines you is how you move forward. How you choose to live now. Elias shook his head, his hands clenching into fists. You don't understand. You don't know what it's like to carry this weight. It's crushing me, Azrael. Every day it gets heavier, and I don't know how much longer I can bear it. Azrael's expression softened, and he placed a hand on Elias's chest, just over his heart. Then let me help you carry it, he said. You don't have to do this alone. Elias looked down at the angel's hand, his breath hitching. He wanted to believe him, to trust him, but the weight of his past was so heavy, so suffocating, that it felt impossible to let go. I don't know how, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Azrael smiled faintly. You don't have to know. Just take the first step. Trust me. Elias hesitated, his mind racing. He had spent so long drowning in his own despair that the idea of hope felt foreign, almost terrifying. But there was something about Azrael's presence, his unwavering faith, that made him want to try. Okay, he said finally, his voice shaky but determined. I'll try. Azrael's smile widened, and he stepped back, his wings spreading wide. Then let's begin. With a wave of his hand, the angel summoned a new set of images. These were different from the ones before, darker, more chaotic. They showed Elias's mistakes, his failures, the moments he had tried so hard to forget. But instead of shying away from them, Azrael guided Elias through each one, helping him face the pain head-on. This is part of you, Azrael said as they walked through the memories. But it's not all of you. You have to acknowledge it, learn from it, and then let it go. Elias flinched as they passed a particularly painful memory. A fight with someone he had loved, words spoken in anger that could never be taken back. He wanted to turn away, to bury the memory again, but Azrael stopped him. Look at it, the angel said firmly. Really look. What do you see? Elias forced himself to focus, his heart pounding in his chest. At first, all he saw was the anger, the hurt. But as he looked closer, he noticed something else. The fear in the other person's eyes, the pain that mirrored his own. He realized then that he hadn't been the only one suffering. He hadn't been the only one carrying a weight. I see that I wasn't alone, Elias said slowly, his voice filled with realization. I was so focused on my own pain that I didn't see theirs. Azrael nodded, a hint of pride in his eyes. Exactly. And now that you see it, what will you do? Elias took a deep breath, his hands trembling. I don't know. How do I fix it? How do I make it right? You can't change the past, Azrael said gently, but you can choose how you move forward. You can choose to be better, to do better. And sometimes that starts with forgiveness for others and for yourself. Elias stared at the memory, his mind racing. Forgiveness. It was such a simple word, but it felt impossible. How could he forgive himself for the pain he had caused? How could he let go of the guilt that had been eating him alive? Azrael seemed to sense his hesitation. It won't be easy, he said, but it's necessary. You can't carry this weight forever, Elias. It will destroy you if you do. Elias closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face. He wanted to believe Azrael, to trust that he could find a way to forgive himself. But the guilt was so deep, so ingrained, that it felt like a part of him. I don't know if I can, he admitted, his voice breaking. Azrael placed a hand on his shoulder, his touch warm and reassuring. You don't have to do it all at once. Just take the first step. That's all I'm asking. Elias nodded, his breath hitching. Okay, he whispered. I'll try. The angel smiled, his golden eyes filled with hope. That's all I can ask. The veil began to dissolve around them, the shimmering plain and swirling galaxies fading into a soft, golden light. Elias felt a gentle tug, as if the world itself was guiding him back to reality. When he opened his eyes, he was standing in his apartment once more, the morning sun streaming through the windows. Azrael stood beside him, his wings now folded neatly behind him, his presence calm and steady. For a moment, Elias simply stood there, his mind reeling from everything he had just experienced. The memories, the emotions, the weight of his past, it all felt so raw, so immediate. But there was something else too, something he hadn't felt in a long time, a faint glimmer of hope. Azrael turned to him, his golden eyes filled with quiet encouragement. You've taken the first step, he said. That's more than most people can say. Elias nodded, though his heart was still heavy. What do I do now? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The angel smiled faintly. Now you take the next step, and the one after that. It won't be easy, but you don't have to do it alone. I'll be here every step of the way. Elias looked at him, his expression a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. Why? He asked. Why are you doing this for me? I'm just one person. I'm not special. Azrael's smile softened and he placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. You are special, Elias. Not because of what you've done or what you've been through, but because of who you are. You have a light inside you, even if you can't see it right now. And it's my job, no, my privilege, to help you find it. Elias swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. He wanted to believe Azrael, to trust that he was worth the effort. But the doubts were still there, whispering in the back of his mind. What if I fail? He asked, his voice trembling. What if I can't do this? Azrael's gaze was steady, unwavering. Then we'll try again. And again. And again. Failure isn't the end, Elias. It's just another step on the journey. Elias took a deep breath, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling beneath his feet. But Azrael was there, holding out a hand, offering him a lifeline. Okay, he said finally, his voice shaky but determined. I'll try. Azrael nodded, his expression filled with pride. That's all I ask. Over the next few days, Azrael stayed by Elias's side, guiding him through the process of healing. It wasn't easy. There were moments when Elias wanted to give up, when the weight of his past felt too heavy to bear. But every time he faltered, Azrael was there, offering words of encouragement, reminding him of the light he carried within. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elias sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his hands. He had been quiet all day, lost in thought. Azrael stood nearby, his presence a silent comfort. I think I need to apologize, Elias said, suddenly breaking the silence. Azrael tilted his head, his golden eyes curious. To whom? Elias hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. To her. The person I hurt. The one I couldn't forgive myself for hurting. Azrael's expression softened and he nodded. That's a good first step. Elias looked up at him, his eyes filled with uncertainty. But what if she doesn't want to hear it? What if she hates me? Then that's her choice, Azrael said gently. but you can't control how she responds. All you can do is take responsibility for your actions and offer your apology. The rest is up to her." Elias nodded, though his heart was pounding in his chest. He reached for his phone, his hands trembling as he scrolled through his contacts. When he found her name, he hesitated, his finger hovering over the screen. "What if I mess it up?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Azrael placed a hand on his shoulder, his touch warm and reassuring. "You might," he admitted. "But that's okay. What matters is that you're trying. That's what forgiveness is all about, trying even when it's hard." Elias took a deep breath and pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Just as he was about to give up, she answered. "Hello?" Her voice was cautious, guarded. Elias's heart skipped a beat, but he forced himself to speak. "Hi. It's me. Elias." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "What do you want?" she asked, her tone cold. Elias closed his eyes, his chest tight with emotion. I wanted to say I'm sorry for everything. I know I hurt you, and I know I can't take that back. But I want you to know that I regret it. Every day, I regret it." There was another pause, and for a moment Elias thought she might hang up. But then she spoke, her voice softer this time. "Why now? Why are you saying this now?" Elias opened his eyes, his gaze flickering to Azrael, who gave him an encouraging nod. "Because I'm trying to be better," he said. "Because I've been carrying this guilt for so long, and I realized that I can't move forward until I face it. Until I face you." There was silence on the other end of the line, and Elias held his breath, waiting for her response. Finally, she sighed. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said quietly. "Not yet, but I appreciate the apology. It means something." Elias nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "That's all I can ask," he said. "Thank you for listening." They said their goodbyes, and Elias hung up the phone, his hands still trembling. He looked at Azrael, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. "It didn't fix everything," he said quietly. Azrael shook his head. "No, it didn't, but it was a step. And sometimes that's enough." Elias nodded, his chest feeling lighter than it had in years. He knew there was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. The days turned into weeks, and Elias continued to take small, tentative steps toward healing. Azrael remained by his side, a constant presence of encouragement and guidance. The angel's unwavering faith in him was both a comfort and a challenge. It was comforting to know that someone believed in him, but it was also a reminder of how far he still had to go. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, Elias sat on the fire escape outside his apartment, staring out at the city. Azrael stood beside him, his wings glowing faintly in the fading light. "Do you ever get tired of this?" Elias asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Azrael raised an eyebrow. "Tired of what?" Of helping people like me, people who are broken. "Don't you ever feel like it's pointless?" The angel smiled faintly and leaned against the railing. "There are moments when it feels overwhelming," he admitted, "when the darkness seems too great and the light too faint. But then I see moments like this, moments of growth, of hope, and I remember why I do this." Elias looked at him, his expression thoughtful. "You really believe in me, don't you?" Azrael met his gaze, his golden eyes filled with sincerity. "I do, because I've seen the light within you, Elias, even when you couldn't see it yourself." Elias turned away, his chest tightening with emotion. He wanted to believe Azrael, to trust that he was capable of change. But the doubts were still there, whispering in the back of his mind. "What if I can't do it?" he asked quietly. "What if I'm not strong enough?" Azrael placed a hand on his shoulder, his touch warm and reassuring. "You are stronger than you think, and you don't have to do it alone. That's what I'm here for." Elias nodded, though his heart was still heavy. He knew Azrael was right, but the journey ahead felt daunting. He had spent so long drowning in his own despair that the idea of hope still felt foreign, almost terrifying. The next morning, Elias woke up with a sense of purpose. He had spent the night thinking about Azrael's words, about the light within him. He didn't know if he could fully believe in it yet, but he was willing to try. He decided to start small. He cleaned his apartment, something he hadn't done in months. As he worked, he found himself reflecting on the life he had built. Or rather, the life he had let fall apart. It was a painful process, but it was also cathartic. With each item he sorted, each surface he cleaned, he felt a little lighter, as if he was shedding the weight of his past. Azrael watched him quietly, his presence a silent source of support. He didn't offer advice or guidance unless Elias asked for it. Instead, he simply stood by, a reminder that Elias wasn't alone. When the apartment was finally clean, Elias stood in the center of the room, his hands on his hips, and took a deep breath. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "What's next?" he asked, turning to Azrael. The angel smiled. "That's up to you. What do you want to do?" Elias thought for a moment, his gaze drifting to the window. The city was alive with activity, people going about their lives, each with their own struggles and triumphs. For the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of curiosity, a desire to be a part of it all. I think I want to help people," he said slowly. "Not in a big way, just small things, the way you've helped me." Azrael's smile widened, and he nodded. "That's a good goal. But remember, you have to take care of yourself first. You can't pour from an empty cup." Elias nodded, his resolve strengthening. He didn't know how he was going to do it, but he was determined to try. For the first time in years, he felt like he had a purpose, a reason to keep going. Over the next few weeks, Elias began to take small steps toward reconnecting with the world. He volunteered at a local shelter, helping serve meals to those in need. At first, it was overwhelming, and he often felt like he was in over his head. But with Azrael's encouragement, he kept going. One evening, as he was cleaning up after dinner, a young boy approached him. The boy couldn't have been more than 10 years old, his clothes worn and his face smudged with dirt. He looked up at Elias with wide, hopeful eyes. "Thank you," the boy said quietly, "for the food." Elias knelt down, his heart aching at the sight of the child. "You're welcome," he said softly. Are you here alone?" The boy shook his head. "My mom's over there," he said, pointing to a woman sitting at one of the tables. "She's tired, so I came to say thank you." Elias nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "You're a good kid," he said. "Take care of your mom, okay?" The boy smiled and nodded before running back to his mother. Elias watched him go, his chest filled with a strange mix of sorrow and hope. He realized then that helping others wasn't just about fixing their problems. It was about showing them that they weren't alone, that someone cared. Azrael appeared beside him, his presence a silent comfort. "You're making a difference," the angel said softly, "even if it doesn't feel like it." Elias nodded, though his eyes were filled with tears. "I just wish I could do more." "You will," Azrael said, "one step at a time." As the months passed, Elias continued to grow. He still had moments of doubt, moments when the weight of his past threatened to pull him under. But with Azrael's guidance, he learned to face those moments head-on, to acknowledge the pain without letting it define him. One evening, as they stood on the rooftop of Elias's apartment building, watching the city lights flicker below, Azrael turned to him. "You've come a long way," the angel said, his voice filled with pride. Elias smiled faintly. "I couldn't have done it without you." Azrael shook his head. "You did the work, Elias. I was just here to remind you of your strength." Elias looked at him, his expression filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for never giving up on me." Azrael smiled, his golden eyes shining in the moonlight. "I never will."